My name is Jack Miller, and this happened to me back in 1956 when I was working as a park ranger in Everglades National Park down in Florida. I still remember everything like it was yesterday, though sometimes I wish I could forget. The doctors say my condition is getting worse, my bones slowly turning to coral, becoming part of the swamp, but I need to tell this story while I still can. I was 32 then. Had been a ranger for almost 8 years. Loved my job. Loved the quiet mornings when mist would hang over the water like a white blanket. Loved watching the sunrise paint the sky in oranges and pinks. The Everglades were my home, and I thought I knew all their secrets. Boy, was I wrong. It started on a Tuesday morning in March. The air was thick and humid, like it always is down there. I was doing my regular patrol in my boat, checking on some of the remote areas where we'd had reports of poachers. That's when I saw something white glinting through the mangrove trees. At first, I thought it might be trash. Tourists were always leaving things behind. But something about the way it caught the light made my stomach tight. I steered my boat closer, pushing through the hanging vines and branches. When I finally got close enough to see what it was, I nearly fell out of my boat. There, arranged in a perfect circle on a small patch of dry ground, were human bones. Not just scattered around, mind you, but carefully placed in a pattern, like someone had spent hours getting them just right. I radioed back to headquarters right away. Something this serious needed backup. Within an hour, Dave Thompson, our forensics expert, was out there with me. While we waited for the police to arrive, we took photos and started looking around the area. "Jack, come look at this," Dave called out, his voice shaking a bit. He was pointing at something carved into a nearby tree. It looked old, really old, with strange symbols I'd never seen before. Right then, a gust of wind blew through the trees, and I swear the temperature dropped about 10 degrees. That same week, things got worse. 5 tourists who'd gone hiking near that area went missing. They'd signed in at the visitor center, the Johnson family from Ohio. Mom, Dad, and 3 kids. When they didn't come back by sunset, we knew something was wrong. We found their campsite exactly as they'd left it. Food still on paper plates, tent perfectly set up, even their car keys hanging from a branch. But no people, not a single footprint leading away from the camp. I couldn't sleep after that. Every night I'd lie awake thinking about those bones and the missing family. The local police weren't helping much. They kept saying people get lost in the Everglades all the time. But this felt different. Those bones I found weren't just dumped there. They were arranged, like some kind of message. Then, one morning, I found another bone circle, this time closer to the main trail, but these bones looked fresher. And there was something else, a child's sneaker, the same kind the youngest Johnson kid had been wearing. My hands were shaking as I took photos. The weird thing was, when I developed them later, all the pictures came out blurry, like something was moving in them, even though I know those bones were perfectly still. I spent hours in the park's library after that, reading everything I could about the area's history. That's when I found it. An old newspaper article from 1832 about a Native American burial ground that early settlers had disturbed. The article mentioned strange symbols carved into trees, the same ones I'd seen. The more I dug into the area's history, the more worried I got. Every night, strange noises echoed across the water, not like the usual sounds of animals or birds, but like bones clicking together. The other rangers started noticing it too. Some refused to do night patrols anymore. Then came the night that changed everything. I was working late, going through old maps in my office when I heard screaming from outside. I grabbed my flashlight and ran out. The screams were coming from near that first bone circle I'd found. What I saw there. Well, even now, decades later, my hands shake when I think about it. In the beam of my flashlight, I saw bones moving by themselves. They were floating in the air, clicking together like puzzle pieces. Right in front of me, they started forming a shape, a skeleton, but not a normal one. It was huge, made up of bones from different people. I could tell because some were old and yellow, while others looked newer. I radioed for backup immediately. 7 of our best rangers responded. We armed ourselves with whatever we could find, flashlights, flares, even the fire extinguisher from the office. We thought numbers would keep us safe. We were wrong. The thing, that skeleton creature, it moved like nothing I've ever seen. Fast as lightning when it wanted to be, quiet as a shadow other times. One by one, it took my friends. Poor Tom was the first. We just heard him yell, "Oh God!" And when we got to him, there was nothing left but his uniform, empty on the ground. Then Sarah, then Mike, all of them gone in different horrible ways. I remember thinking, this isn't happening. This can't be real. But it was. I could see the bones moving through the trees, getting closer and closer. The air smelled like old graves and swamp water, and that clicking sound, that awful clicking sound, just kept getting louder. I ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. After watching all my friends disappear, I ran as fast as I could. But in the Everglades, running isn't easy. The ground is wet. There are roots everywhere. And that night, it felt like the whole swamp was against me. The skeleton thing followed, always just behind me. I could hear it. That horrible clicking sound of bones moving together. I ended up trapped on a small piece of dry land, surrounded by deep water. The skeleton creature came closer, and in the moonlight, I could see it clearly now. Parts of it were glowing with a sickly green light, like the moss that grows on old trees. But worse than that, I could see faces in it. Faces of people I knew, the missing tourists, my fellow rangers. All twisted up in there somehow. That's when it reached for me. Its bony fingers touched my arm, and I felt the coldest pain I've ever known. Like ice was growing inside my bones. I managed to pull away and jump into the water, but the damage was done. Where it touched me, my skin felt different, hard and rough, like coral. I swam and swam, not knowing where I was going. Behind me, I heard a sound like thousands of bones falling into water, then silence. When the sun came up, I was found by a search party. They'd been looking for us all night. I tried to tell them what happened, but who would believe such a story? That was 68 years ago. The doctors can't explain what's happening to me. Slowly, year by year, my bones are changing, turning into something like coral. It spreads a little more each day. The specialists say they've never seen anything like it. Sometimes, late at night, I can still hear that clicking sound, like bones moving together, coming from somewhere in the dark. The Everglades Park Service filled in that area with concrete years ago. They built new trails, put up fresh signs, tried to forget what happened. But I know the truth. Something ancient lives in those swamps, something that remembers when its land was taken, something that's still hungry after all these years. And sometimes when I look at my changing hands, I wonder if maybe it's not done with me yet. Last week I got a letter from a young ranger working in the Everglades. He wrote about finding strange bone circles in a new section of the park, far from where everything happened in '56. He wanted to know if I'd ever seen anything like it. My hands shook so bad I could barely write back. I told him to leave it alone, to quit his job if he had to, but stay away from those bones. But I know he won't listen. I wouldn't have listened back then either. Young folks never do. Yesterday, the pain in my bones got worse. Looking in the mirror, I can see patches of coral growing up my neck now. The doctors say I don't have much time left. But here's the really scary part. Lately, when I'm alone, my fingers sometimes move by themselves, making that same clicking sound I heard in the swamp. I dream about it too. In my dreams, I'm back there. But this time, I'm part of that bone creature. And we're waiting for more people to come looking for answers about those circles. If you're ever down in the Everglades and you see something white glinting through the trees, don't go looking. Don't try to solve the mystery. Just turn around and leave. Because some secrets should stay buried, and some circles should never be broken. They found 5 new bone circles this morning. I saw it on the news, and my hands. They won't stop clicking. My name is Frank Harrison. I never thought I'd share this story, but what happened to me at Mount Rainier back in 1964 needs to be told. Some nights, I still wake up in a cold sweat, remembering the horrors I saw in those icy caves. Even now, 60 years later, I can't go near the mountains or feel comfortable around snow. This is my story. Back then, I was a park ranger at Mount Rainier National Park in Washington State. I loved my job, being out in nature, helping visitors, and working alongside my wife Sarah, who was also a ranger. We had a small cabin near the park entrance, and life was good, really good, until that terrible February when everything changed. It started with the dead animals. First, we found a few frozen deer scattered around the lower slopes. Nothing too unusual for winter, except they were missing their skin, completely flayed, like something had peeled them layer by layer. Then we started finding more: rabbits, foxes, even a bear. All skinned, all frozen solid. The morning everything escalated started like any other. I was doing my usual patrol when my radio crackled with a distress call. A group of hikers reported something strange at one of our camping grounds, about halfway up the mountain. "Blood in the snow," they said. "Lots of it, red against white." I grabbed my gear and headed up there right away. The whole time I had this weird feeling in my stomach, like when you know something bad is about to happen but can't explain why. The air felt different too, colder, heavier somehow. When I reached the campsite, I knew immediately something was terribly wrong. The snow around the area wasn't just spotted with blood, it was completely red, like someone had spilled red paint everywhere. And the tents, they were torn to shreds. But what I found inside them, I still have trouble talking about it. 12 people, all of them, skinned, just like the animals we'd been finding. Their faces frozen in expressions of pure terror. Some were still in their sleeping bags. Others looked like they'd tried to run. The temperature was well below freezing, and their bodies were completely frozen solid. I radioed for backup immediately, my hands shaking so bad I could barely press the button. "This is Ranger Harrison," I managed to say. "We have a mass casualty situation at Campsite 7. I need all available personnel, and bring the police." While waiting for help, I noticed something else: tracks in the bloody snow. They didn't look like any animal tracks I'd ever seen in my 20 years as a ranger. They were different, like something had slithered and crawled at the same time, leaving weird, wavy patterns in the snow. and they all led in one direction, toward an ice cave higher up the mountain that we rarely patrolled. Within an hour, 4 other rangers arrived, including my wife Sarah and my best friend Mike. None of us were prepared for what we were about to face. The police were still hours away due to a snowstorm, and we knew we couldn't wait. Whatever did this might still be out there, maybe hunting more campers. We followed the strange tracks up to the ice cave. I'd been past it hundreds of times but never gone inside. It was just a narrow crack in the mountainside that went deep into the rock. Now, standing at its entrance, I could hear something, a soft, wet, sliding sound coming from inside. "We should wait for backup," Mike said, shining his flashlight into the darkness. But Sarah spotted fresh blood drops in the snow leading inside. We switched on our flashlights and entered the cave single file. The walls were solid ice, reflecting our lights in weird ways. The temperature dropped even lower, and our breath came out in thick white clouds. That sliding sound got louder. Then Jimmy, one of our newer rangers, called out from the back, "My chest. It feels weird." His voice sounded strange, scared. We turned around just in time to see him fall to his knees. What happened next? I still see it in my nightmares. Something burst out of Jimmy's chest. It looked like a worm, but bigger than any worm should be, covered in tiny ice crystals. Before we could react, 2 more rangers screamed. The same thing was happening to them. These parasites were bursting out of their bodies, leaving them like empty shells. Sarah grabbed my arm. "Run!" she screamed. But we both knew we couldn't let these things get out of the cave. They'd kill everyone on the mountain. Sarah was always the quickest thinker among us. While I stood there frozen in horror, she remembered something crucial. We'd stored dynamite in our packs for avalanche control. As more of those ice worms slithered toward us, getting bigger by the second, she grabbed the dynamite. "Frank," she said, looking at me with tears freezing on her cheeks, "you need to run, now." I knew what she was planning, and I tried to stop her, to say we'd find another way. But she pushed me hard toward the cave entrance. "I'm already infected," she whispered, showing me a small cut on her hand where one of the creatures had scratched her. "I can feel it inside me, but I won't let them take anyone else." The last thing I saw was her smile. That beautiful, brave smile I'd fallen in love with years ago. Then she shoved me again, harder. "Go." I ran. I ran faster than I'd ever run in my life. Behind me I heard Sarah's voice echo through the cave. "Come and get me, you monsters!" The explosion shook the entire mountain. Rocks and ice came crashing down, sealing the cave forever. Sarah and those things were buried under tons of rock and ice. I fell to my knees in the snow and screamed until my voice gave out. But that wasn't the end of my story. The doctors found something in my blood, dormant parasites, frozen but not dead. They could wake up if I ever get too cold. That's why I live alone now, in the Arizona desert. I can never risk being near ice or snow again. Never risk those things waking up. Sometimes on cold nights, I can feel them stirring inside me. And I think about Sarah, about her sacrifice, about how she saved not just me, but maybe the whole world from those ancient ice creatures. I've never told anyone this story before. Most people wouldn't believe it anyway. But every year, when I hear about hikers going missing on Mount Rainier, I wonder, did we really get them all? My name is Marcus Reeves, and this happened to me back in 1973 when I was working as a park ranger in Sequoia National Park. You might not believe what I'm about to tell you, but every word of it is true. I've kept quiet about it for years, but now that I'm older, I think people need to know what happened in those woods. I remember everything like it was yesterday. The giant sequoias had stood there for thousands of years, some of them wider than my cabin and taller than buildings. I'd been working in the park for 15 years by then, and I thought I knew every trail, every tree, and every sound those woods could make. But I was wrong. So terribly wrong. It started on a cold morning in October. I was doing my usual patrol near the Johnston logging camp. Just a small operation with 15 men who had permits to cut trees in a marked area at the edge of the park. As I walked past some of the older sequoias that morning, something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just the way the sunlight was hitting the bark, making strange shadows. But when I got closer, my blood ran cold. There, in the bark of an ancient sequoia, was what looked exactly like a human face. Not just some random pattern that kind of resembled a face. I mean a real, detailed human face, like someone pressing against a sheet. The worst part? I recognized it. It was Tom Johnston, the logging camp supervisor. I'd had coffee with him just 3 days ago. I ran to the logging camp, my heart pounding. But when I got there, the place was empty. 15 men, all gone. Coffee cups still sat on tables, half full and cold. Chainsaws lay where they'd been dropped. Work boots stood empty by bunks. The loggers had vanished into thin air, leaving everything behind. Even their trucks were still parked in a neat row. That was just the beginning of the nightmare. I didn't know it then, but those ancient trees had woken up hungry, and they had developed a taste for human flesh. Would you like me to continue with the next part of the story? I called for backup right away, but nobody believed what I told them about the face in the tree. They focused on searching for the missing loggers instead. 3 more rangers came to help: Mike, Sarah, and Dave. We spent days looking through the woods, calling out names and checking every possible trail. That's when we started finding more faces in the trees. Not just 1 or 2, but dozens of them. Each one looked like someone pressed against the bark from the inside. Some had their mouths open in silent screams. I recognized all 15 of the missing loggers among them. "We need to get out of here," I told the other rangers. "Something's very wrong with these trees." But they thought I was just spooked by shadows and tree bark patterns. We set up camp that night, even though every part of me was screaming to leave. I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, I heard a sound I'll never forget, like tree branches moving, but somehow wet and sticky. I unzipped my tent and shined my flashlight toward Sarah's tent. What I saw made my heart stop. The tree next to her tent had changed. Its bark was rippling like water, and long, dark tendrils were slowly wrapping around her tent. "Sarah!" I screamed. "Everyone, wake up!" And there, in the bark of the tree, was a new face, Sarah's face, her eyes wide with terror. Mike tried to run. Dave just stood there, frozen in shock. The trees around us came alive. Their branches reached down like arms, their bark splitting open to reveal dark, hungry mouths. I grabbed Dave's arm and pulled him away just as a branch tried to grab him. We ran through the dark forest, branches whipping at our faces. Behind us, I heard Mike scream. When I looked back, he was being pulled into the trunk of a massive sequoia, the bark closing around him like quicksand. Dave and I made it back to the ranger station, but nobody would listen to our story. They said we were crazy, that maybe we'd drunk some bad water or eaten some weird mushrooms. The next day, Dave disappeared from his bed. I found his face in a tree near the station, right next to Mike's and Sarah's. I knew then that I was the only one who knew the truth, and the trees. They knew that too. The worst part of my nightmare began when my daughter Jenny came to visit. She was 22 and worried about me after hearing strange rumors about my behavior. I tried to warn her to stay away, but she wouldn't listen. "Dad," she said, "you're not making any sense. They're just trees." I begged her to leave the park, but she insisted on staying at my cabin. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept watching the trees outside her window, their branches swaying, even though there wasn't any wind. I had hidden all the faces from her during the day, taking her only on trails where the trees were still normal. But I knew the hungry ones were getting closer. Around midnight, I heard Jenny's door open. "Dad?" she called out. "Do you hear that, it sounds like? Singing?" My heart nearly stopped. I ran to her room, but she was already walking outside in her pajamas, like she was in some kind of trance. The trees were making a sound, a low humming noise that seemed to call to her. Their branches were reaching down, swaying like they were dancing in the moonlight. "Jenny, stop!" I screamed, running after her. She turned to look at me, but her eyes were strange, like she was dreaming. She smiled and said, "Dad, they're so beautiful. They're showing me such wonderful things." I tried to grab her arm, but she stepped away from me. The nearest tree's bark began to ripple and open, like arms reaching out to hug her. Jenny walked right into them, still smiling that dreamy smile. I pulled and pulled at her, but the tree was stronger. The last thing I saw was her face, peaceful and calm, as it sank into the bark. When the bark sealed up, her face was there with all the others. But unlike them, she wasn't screaming. She was still smiling that peaceful smile, like she had found something wonderful. That's when I knew the trees hadn't just taken her body. They had somehow taken her mind first. I sat there until sunrise, touching the bark where my daughter's face was, crying and apologizing for not protecting her better. But as the sun came up, I knew what I had to do. These trees had taken my friends. They had taken my daughter. And they wouldn't stop there. Someone had to end this, even if it meant destroying a forest that had stood for thousands of years. Even if it meant I wouldn't make it out alive. I knew what had to be done. I gathered every can of gasoline from the ranger station and my truck. Late that night, when everyone else had gone home, I started my work. My hands were shaking as I poured gasoline in big circles around the infected part of the forest. Every few steps I'd see another face in another tree. People I knew, people I loved, all of them trapped forever. The trees knew what I was planning. Their branches started reaching for me, trying to stop me. The humming sound got louder, like they were angry. Some branches caught my jacket, but I pulled free. I could hear Jenny's voice calling to me from her tree, begging me to join her. "It's so peaceful here, Dad," she kept saying. "You'll understand if you just come closer." But I kept working. When the gas cans were empty, I took out my matches. The trees were really moving now, their branches whipping through the air like angry arms. I lit the first match and dropped it. The fire caught faster than I expected. The trees screamed. Not like a person screams. It was more like the sound of wood cracking in a campfire, but 100 times louder. The faces in their bark twisted in pain. Jenny's face was the worst. Her peaceful smile turned to shock as the flames spread. I should have run then, but I couldn't leave Jenny. I watched as the fire spread from tree to tree, making sure it would destroy all of them. The smoke was getting thick, and the heat was horrible. Burning branches were falling everywhere. That's when I saw it. The biggest tree, right in the center, was different from the others. Its trunk was splitting open, showing something dark inside, like a mouth. I think it was their leader, the one that had started it all. I had one gas can left. I knew what I had to do. I ran straight at that tree, holding the last can of gas. Branches grabbed at me, burning and smoking, but I didn't stop. I threw the gas can right into that dark opening and lit my last match. The explosion was the last thing I remember. They found my body 3 days later, after the fire had finally died down. The official story says I went crazy and set fire to 500 acres of protected forest. Maybe that's better than the truth. The fire destroyed all the infected trees, and all the faces disappeared with them. No one ever found a trace of the missing people, including Jenny. Sometimes I wonder if I did the right thing, burning down those ancient trees. But then I remember the faces and Jenny's smile, and I know I had no choice. The trees are growing back now, fresh and new, normal trees. But if you're ever hiking in Sequoia National Park and you think you see a face in the bark of a tree or hear a strange humming sound, run. Run as fast as you can, and don't look back. My name is Helen Martinez, and this happened to me back in 1990 when I was working as a park ranger at Joshua Tree National Park in California. I've never told anyone the full story before, but now I think it's time. Maybe writing it down will help me make peace with what happened, even though I'll never be able to see these words myself. I loved being a ranger. The desert was my home, and I knew every trail, every rock formation, and every twisted Joshua tree in my section of the park. During the day, I'd help lost hikers, give talks about desert safety, and make sure everyone followed the park rules. But it was during the night shifts that everything changed. It started on a cool October evening. I was doing my usual drive along the main park road when my headlights caught something strange. A group of tourists walking into the desert. They were moving in a straight line, like soldiers marching. But something wasn't right. They wore regular clothes, shorts, t-shirts, flip-flops. Definitely not what you'd wear for a night hike in the desert. I called out to them, but they didn't even turn around. They just kept walking, stepping over rocks and cacti, like they couldn't even feel the thorns. I radioed it in and followed them in my truck as far as I could, then on foot. But they disappeared into the darkness. The next morning, we found their empty car in the parking lot, with their phones, wallets, and water bottles still inside. That was just the beginning. Over the next few days, more people started disappearing. They'd walk away from their campsites at night, leaving everything behind. Some were alone, others in groups, but they all walked in that same weird way, like they were sleeping with their eyes open. We searched everywhere, but the desert kept swallowing them up. I didn't know it then, but I was about to discover something that would change my life forever. Something that had been hiding in Joshua Tree National Park for who knows how long, waiting in an ancient tree, hungry for human minds. But that's just how it started. The real horror was still to come, and by the time I figured out what we were dealing with, it was almost too late. After 2 weeks, 56 people had vanished. The newspapers started calling us, asking questions we couldn't answer. My boss was getting pressure from everyone, the police, the FBI, even some scientists who study strange events, but none of them could explain what was happening. I couldn't sleep at night anymore. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those blank faces walking into the darkness. One night, I decided to follow another group, 3 college students this time. I kept my flashlight off and stayed far behind them. That's when I noticed something weird. They were all heading to the same place, a part of the park we called Old Grove because of its ancient Joshua trees. The oldest tree there was massive, probably hundreds of years old, with twisted branches reaching up like fingers against the stars. As I watched from behind a rock, the students walked right up to it. In the moonlight, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The tree. It was glowing. Not like regular glowing, but with a soft purple light that seemed to pulse, like a heartbeat. But that wasn't the worst part. Near the base of the tree, I found things I wish I could forget. Shoes, clothes, and bones. Lots of bones. They were scattered around the tree in a perfect circle, like some kind of horrible garden. I knew right then that all those missing people had ended up here. I grabbed my radio to call for backup, but before I could press the button, I felt something brush against my mind. It was like when you're about to fall asleep, but someone calls your name, that floaty, dreamy feeling. But this was different. This felt hungry. A voice whispered in my head, "Join us, Helen. Become part of something greater." I ran. I ran faster than I'd ever run in my life, stumbling over rocks, scratching my arms on cacti. But I didn't care, because for just a second, I had felt what that thing wanted. It wasn't just killing people, it was eating their minds, making them part of itself. And now it knew my name. As I drove back to the ranger station, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, I realized something even scarier. How many of my fellow rangers had already heard that voice? How many of them were already under its control? I started watching my fellow rangers closely after that night. Little things began to jump out at me. How Tom wouldn't make eye contact anymore. How Sarah kept walking toward Old Grove during her breaks, until someone called her name. But the scariest thing was how they all started humming the same tune, a melody I'd never heard before. One morning, I came into the ranger station early. 8 of my colleagues were sitting in a circle, holding hands. They didn't move when I opened the door, didn't even blink, just sat there, humming that awful tune. Their eyes had a purple glow, just like that tree. "We understand now, Helen," they said together, their voices blending in a way that human voices shouldn't. "It's so beautiful here, in the hive. You should join us." I backed away, but they stood up as one. "The tree has been so lonely," they said. "It's been waiting for thousands of years, sleeping in the desert. But now it's awake, and it's so hungry. We're going to feed it, Helen. All of us. Won't you help?" They started walking toward me, moving in that horrible, synchronized way. I ran to my truck and locked the doors. Through the window, I watched them walk into the desert, toward Old Grove. I followed at a distance, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. What I saw next still haunts me. They gathered around the tree, still humming. The purple light grew brighter and brighter. Then they started walking into the tree, not hitting it, walking into it like it was made of water. One by one, they disappeared. The last one turned to look at me, smiled, and then was gone. I sat there until sunrise, crying, watching that tree pulse with purple light. My friends were gone. The thing in the tree had taken them, just like it had taken all those tourists. And now it was getting stronger. I knew I had to stop it. But how do you fight something that can control minds? Something that could make you walk right into its trap with just a whisper in your head? That's when I remembered something. It had to make eye contact to control you. It had to make you see that purple light, and that's when I knew what I had to do. God help me. I knew exactly what I had to do to end this. I went back to my truck and got the emergency flares and a can of gasoline we kept for the generators. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold them. I knew what the tree could do to me if I looked at it, if I saw that purple light even for a second. There was only one way to make sure that wouldn't happen. I parked my truck facing the old grove, turned on the high beams, and took one last look at the desert sunrise. It was beautiful, all orange and pink, with long shadows stretching across the sand. I wanted to remember it forever. Then I took out my lighter. I'm not proud of what I did next, but I had to stop this thing before it took more people. I held the lighter in one hand and whispered, "I'm sorry," before I did it. I pressed the flame against my eyes. The pain was, well, I don't like to think about the pain, but it worked. And that meant the tree couldn't control me. Even blind, I knew the path to Old Grove by heart. I'd walked it 1,000 times. I could feel the tree trying to get into my mind, but without being able to see its light, its power was weaker. It was like a radio station with bad reception, just static and whispers. I followed the sound of its humming. When I felt the rough bark under my hands, I knew I'd found it. I poured the gasoline all around the base, my hands touching those bones, all that was left of its victims. The tree's whispers turned to screams in my head, but I didn't stop. I lit the flares one by one and threw them. The heat hit me like a wall. The screaming in my head got so loud I thought my skull would crack. But then, silence, just the sound of fire crackling. They found me passed out near the burning tree. The official report says it was a tragic accident. 8 rangers lost in the desert, never found. 56 tourists, too. They blamed dehydration, confusion, maybe bad GPS signals. Nobody believed my story about a mind-controlling tree. But sometimes, on quiet nights, I sit outside and listen to the desert. And I wonder, was that the only one? Are there more of those ancient, hungry things out there, waiting to wake up? I can't see anymore, but maybe that's okay. Some things in this world, you're better off not seeing. Sometimes the only way to fight darkness is to go into it yourself. That's my story. Believe it or don't, that's up to you. But if you're ever in Joshua Tree National Park and you hear humming on the wind or feel something trying to whisper in your mind, run as fast as you can. And whatever you do, don't look at the trees. My name is Lisa Walker, and this happened to me back in 1979 when I was working as a park ranger at Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico. I was 32 then, and I had been leading cave tours and rescue operations for almost 8 years. I loved my job. The caves were like a second home to me. Well, at least until that day in October when everything went wrong. I remember it was a chilly morning, and I was doing my usual checks at the visitor center when the emergency call came in. 2 spelunkers, that's what we call cave explorers, hadn't come back from their expedition the day before. Their friends were worried sick because they were experienced cavers who always stuck to their schedule. I gathered my rescue team quickly. We were 6 rangers total, me, Tom, Sarah, Mike, Dave, and Rick. We'd done dozens of rescues together before, and I trusted them with my life. Little did I know that this would be our last mission together. That morning felt different somehow. The cave entrance seemed darker than usual, and the air coming from below was unusually cold. I should have listened to that gut feeling telling me something wasn't right. But how could I have known what we were about to find deep in those ancient tunnels? How could any of us have guessed that beneath the tourist paths and familiar caverns lay something that should have stayed buried forever? If I close my eyes, I can still hear the echoes of screams bouncing off those limestone walls. I can still smell the strange, ancient air that carried with it the scent of death. And sometimes, in my nightmares, I still see those things that hunted us in the dark. This is my story. A story about what we discovered in the deep below, and why some parts of Carlsbad Caverns remain sealed off to this day. A story I've kept to myself for over 40 years, until now. We started our descent into the caves at 7 a.m. The missing spelunkers, John and Pete, had gone into a less explored section of the caverns, away from the regular tourist paths. I led our team through the familiar routes first, our flashlights making long shadows on the wet cave walls. 3 hours into our search, Mike spotted something strange. "Lisa, come look at this," he called out, his voice bouncing off the walls. He was pointing his flashlight at what looked like carvings in the rock, but not the usual graffiti we sometimes found. These were different. They seemed. I remember touching those markings with my gloved hand, feeling how deep they went into the rock. They showed strange symbols and what looked like people, but not like any cave paintings I'd seen before. These figures were tall and thin, with long fingers and large eyes. Next to the carvings, we found pieces of pottery that looked older than anything that should have been there. "This doesn't make sense," Sarah whispered, picking up a broken piece of clay. "There's never been any record of people living this deep in the caves." That's when we heard it, the first scream. It echoed through the tunnels, making us all freeze. It sounded like it came from somewhere above us, where we knew the tourist group was having their morning tour. Then the ground started to shake. At first, it was just a tremor, like a truck driving by. But it got stronger, and suddenly rocks were falling all around us. We could hear the crash of boulders somewhere behind us, and the horrible sound of people screaming from the tourist section. The entrance. But when we tried to return the way we came, we found our path blocked by fallen rocks. The cave-in had cut us off from the main entrance. We weren't just looking for 2 missing spelunkers anymore. Now we had 23 tourists trapped somewhere above us, and no clear way out. Our radios weren't working this deep in the cave. The only way to help anyone was to find another route up to the tourist section. None of us knew then that by trying to save those people, we were heading straight into something's hunting ground. I checked my watch. It was just past noon. In just 6 more hours, half my team would be dead, and I would learn why some places underground should stay undiscovered. We had to find a way to reach the trapped tourists, so we followed a narrow tunnel that seemed to head upward. Our flashlights made weird shadows on the walls, and every drip of water made us jump. That's when Dave noticed something odd about the ground we were walking on. "Look at these marks," he said, crouching down. "They look like scratches. Lots of them." He was right. The stone floor was covered in long scratch marks, like something with claws had been dragging itself along. And they looked fresh. We kept moving, but now everyone was on edge. Sarah walked next to me, her hand shaking as she held her flashlight. "Lisa," she whispered, "do you smell that?" I did. It was a strange smell, like rotten meat, mixed with something else I couldn't place. It got stronger as we went deeper into the tunnel. Then we heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. It wasn't the normal sounds of the cave, like dripping water or settling rocks. This was different. It was like something breathing, but not like any animal I'd ever heard. Rick was at the back of our group. He stopped to check his gear, telling us he'd catch up in a minute. That was the last time we saw him alive. We heard his scream about 2 minutes later, a horrible, terrified sound that cut off suddenly. We ran back, our flashlights dancing wildly across the cave walls. All we found was Rick's flashlight on the ground, still on, and dark smears on the rocks that I knew were blood. There was a new tunnel opened up in the wall, more like a crack, that hadn't been there before. And coming from deep inside it, we could hear that breathing sound again. "We need to keep moving," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Whatever that thing is, we can't help Rick now. We need to find those tourists and get out of here." But Tom shook his head. "We can't just leave him," he said, stepping toward the crack in the wall. "He might still be alive." "Tom, don't," I started to say. But it was too late. Something long and pale shot out of the crack. Something with too many joints in its arm and fingers like needles. It grabbed Tom's leg and pulled. The sound of his screams echoed through the caves as he disappeared into the darkness. 2 of my team gone in less than 5 minutes. And somewhere in the caves above us, 23 tourists had no idea what was down here with them. What was worse, we were now closer to these things than we were to any exit. The 4 of us who were left, me, Sarah, Mike, and Dave, huddled together, our backs against each other. Our flashlights swept the darkness, but it felt like the darkness was alive, moving around us. We could hear noises everywhere, scratching sounds, that awful breathing, and worst of all, distant screams that had to be coming from the tourist group. "We need to get to higher ground," I whispered. "The tourist path should be about 50 feet above us." We found a narrow path that led upward. Dave went first, then Sarah, Mike, and me at the back. The path was so tight we had to go single file. That's when Sarah's flashlight started flickering. "No, no, no," she said, hitting it against her palm. "Not now." Her light went out completely. In the darkness, we heard that breathing sound again. But this time it was right below us. Before any of us could react, something grabbed Sarah's legs. She screamed and grabbed Dave's hand. But whatever had her was too strong. Dave held on as hard as he could, but then we heard a horrible snap. Sarah's scream turned into a gurgle. And then, silence. Dave threw up. Mike started praying. I just stood there. My flashlight pointed down at the empty space where Sarah had been. There was nothing there now, just darkness, and that awful smell getting stronger. We made it to a larger cave about 10 minutes later. Our flashlights showed us something that made my stomach turn. Backpacks, cameras, and other things that had to belong to the tourist group. There was blood on some of them. "Look," Mike pointed to the wall. More of those strange carvings, but these were different. They showed those tall, thin creatures we'd seen carved before. But now we could see what they were doing. They were hunting people. "This isn't just some prehistoric art," Dave said, his voice shaking. "It's a warning." That's when we heard voices, human voices, coming from a tunnel to our right. It was the tourists. We could hear them calling for help. But something felt wrong. The voices sounded off somehow. Like when you hear a recording played back. Mike started running toward the sound. "We found them. Hey, we're coming." "Mike, wait," I yelled. But he didn't listen. He disappeared into the tunnel, following those voices. We heard him scream a few seconds later. A scream that turned into a wet, choking sound. Dave looked at me, his face white as chalk. Those weren't real voices, were they? I shook my head. They're hunting us, I whispered. Like they've been hunting people down here for who knows how long. And they know how to trick us. It was just me and Dave now. We finally found the tourist group, or what was left of them. Only 7 people were still alive, huddled in a small cave chamber. They were terrified, and I understood why. They'd seen what happened to the others. We need to get out of here, I told them. But I knew our chances weren't good. Those things were smart. They'd let these people live on purpose, using them as bait to draw in more victims. Then Dave remembered something. Lisa, the old mining explosives. Remember the sealed-off section we found last month? There should be some left there. He was right. If we could get to that section, maybe we could use the explosives to make a new way out, or at least bury these creatures so they couldn't hurt anyone else. The mining section wasn't far, but getting there was a nightmare. Those things were everywhere now. We could hear them moving in the walls, in the ceiling, under the floor. Sometimes we'd see them in the edge of our flashlight beams, pale, twisted bodies that moved too fast to really see clearly. We made it to the explosives, but that's when everything went completely wrong. Dave was setting the last charge when one of those creatures burst through the wall behind him. Its long fingers wrapped around his throat before he could even scream. I tried to help him, but another one of those things appeared between us. The last thing Dave did was hit the detonator switch. "Run," he shouted at me and the tourists. "Run now." The explosion started to cave in. Rocks were falling everywhere. I grabbed the closest tourist, a teenage girl, and pulled her toward a tunnel I knew led up. "Everyone, this way," I yelled to the others. But only 3 of them made it. The rest, I still hear their screams in my nightmares. We ran until we found a maintenance shaft that led to the surface. As we climbed, I could hear those things following us up the shaft. When the last survivor was out, I knew what I had to do. I had 1 explosive charge left. I set it on the shaft wall and hit the trigger. The blast sealed the shaft completely. Whatever those things were, they're still down there, trapped. But sometimes I wonder how many other entrances to their domain might be hidden in those caves. How long have they been down there, hunting? How long will they keep hunting? The official story says it was a natural cave-in that killed those people. The missing spelunkers were never found. The sealed-off sections of Carlsbad Caverns are marked as unstable on maps. But now you know the real reason why. I quit my job as a ranger after that day. I couldn't go back into any cave, knowing what might be hiding in the dark. Some nights, when I'm lying in bed, I think I can hear that breathing sound coming from deep underground, and I pray that the rocks I brought down are enough to keep those things sealed away forever. My name is Paul Davidson, and this happened to me back in 1983 when I was working as a park ranger in the Great Smoky Mountains. I've kept quiet about it all these years, but I think it's finally time to share what really happened during those 3 terrible months. I loved my job back then. Every morning I'd wake up early and breathe in that fresh mountain air. The sunrise would paint the mountains in beautiful colors, and the morning mist would slowly lift from the valleys, just like it had done for hundreds of years. At least, that's how it used to be, before the strange fog came. It all started on a regular Tuesday in early June. I was doing my usual morning rounds when I got a call about a missing hiker. Now, people getting lost wasn't unusual. it happened every now and then. Most times, they'd just wandered off the trail and needed help finding their way back. But this was different. The missing person was Mark Thompson, an experienced hiker who knew these trails better than most. He'd been coming here for 20 years, and the idea of him getting lost was like saying a fish had forgotten how to swim. What made it even stranger was the weird fog his hiking buddy Tommy kept talking about. It wasn't normal fog, Ranger Davidson, Tommy told me, his hands shaking as he held his coffee cup. It was wrong, too thick, too white, and it moved like it was alive. I didn't believe him at first. I mean, fog is just fog, right? But then I saw it myself the next day. It was like a wall of white, thicker than any mist I'd ever seen in my 15 years on the job. And Tommy was right. It did move strangely, almost like it was searching for something. We never found Mark. Not a backpack, not a boot, not even a single trace. It was like he'd vanished into thin air, or into that fog. That was just the beginning, though. I didn't know it then, but things were about to get much, much worse. Little did I know that Mark would be just the first of 37 people to disappear that summer. And if I'd known what was really hiding in that mist, well, maybe I could have saved some of them. Over the next few weeks, more people started to vanish. First, it was 2 campers from Florida, then a local photographer, and then a family of 4 who'd been having a picnic near Cades Cove. Each time, that strange fog was there, creeping through the trees like a white blanket. My partner, Sarah Chen, was the first one to notice something odd about the fog. "Paul," she said one morning as we were checking out where the family had disappeared, "have you noticed how the birds stop singing when this mist comes?" She was right. Whenever that weird fog rolled in, the forest would go completely silent. No birds, no squirrels, not even insects making noise. It was like everything in nature knew something was wrong. We tried everything we could think of to figure out what was happening. We brought in tracking dogs, but they'd just whimper and refuse to go near the fog. We set up cameras, but they'd either stop working or just show static when the mist came. Even our radios would crackle and die whenever that fog was around. The park officials didn't want to believe us at first. They kept saying it was just coincidence, or that the missing people had probably just gotten lost and would turn up eventually. But I knew better. I'd been watching that fog, studying it. Sometimes, when it was really thick, I could see shapes in it. Not clear shapes, mind you, but something moving around in there. Something that shouldn't exist. One evening, while I was patrolling near the visitor center, I saw something that still gives me nightmares. The fog was rolling in, thick as ever, and I noticed something strange. There were ripples in it, like something was swimming through it. Then I heard it, a soft sound, like wet rubber being stretched. And for just a second, I saw something become almost visible. It was huge, maybe the size of a bear, but it didn't look like any animal I'd ever seen. It was transparent, like jellyfish, with long, reaching limbs that seemed to melt into the fog itself. I radioed Sarah right away. "We need to close the park," I told her, my voice shaking. "Whatever's in that fog, it's not natural, and it's hunting." But by then, it was already too late. The school group was scheduled to arrive the next morning, and what happened to them? Well, that's something I wish I could forget. The school group arrived early that morning, 25 kids and 3 teachers from a middle school in Atlanta. I tried everything I could to stop them from going on their hike. I made up stories about bear sightings, dangerous trails, and bad weather. But the head teacher, Mrs. Roberts, wouldn't listen. She had all their permits in order and said they'd been planning this trip for months. "It's just a bit of fog," she said with a smile. "The kids are excited to learn about the forest ecosystem." I followed them at a distance, my heart pounding with every step. The fog started rolling in about an hour into their hike, thicker than I'd ever seen it. I ran toward the group, shouting for them to turn back. But the mist moved faster than any natural fog could. It surrounded them in seconds. That's when I heard the first scream. Through the white wall of fog, I could see shapes moving, those transparent creatures I'd spotted before, but this time there were dozens of them. The kids were running and screaming, but they couldn't see what was coming for them. The creatures. They were picking them off one by one. I fired my gun into the mist, but the bullets just passed right through those things like they were made of air. I tried to grab as many kids as I could, pushing them toward the trail back to the visitor center. Mrs. Roberts was helping too, gathering students and shoving them to safety. But then I saw one of those things wrap its clear, jelly-like arms around Tommy, a small boy who'd been excitedly showing me his camera just that morning. It lifted him up, and I still hear his screams in my nightmares. The creature just pulled him apart, like a child breaking apart a cookie. There was nothing I could do. We managed to save 16 of the kids and 2 teachers. The others, the fog took them. When it finally cleared, there wasn't a single trace left of the victims. No blood, no clothes, nothing. Just like all the others who had vanished. I sat in my truck for hours afterward, crying and punching the steering wheel. Sarah found me there and tried to comfort me, but I could see in her eyes that she was just as horrified. We both knew we had to do something drastic. We couldn't let this keep happening. "I have an idea," Sarah said, her voice steady despite everything we'd seen. "But it's dangerous, and we'll need to get closer to those things than anyone should." I should have stopped her right then, but I didn't know that her plan would lead to something even worse. Something that would make me wish I'd never set foot in these mountains at all. Sarah's plan seemed simple enough at first. She wanted to study the fog, to understand what these creatures were and maybe find a way to stop them. She set up special equipment around the park, moisture meters, temperature gauges, and video cameras. All normal science stuff. "We need to understand what we're dealing with," she told me, as she checked her instruments one rainy morning. "These things have to have a weakness." I begged her to be careful, to keep her distance. But Sarah was brave, too brave, maybe. She started going out alone with her equipment, getting closer and closer to the fog each time. She said she needed better readings, better footage. Then came that terrible day. I was in my office when I heard her scream over the radio. Paul, they're different today." Her voice was shaking. "The fog, it's not just carrying them anymore. It's, oh God, it burns." I ran to her location as fast as I could. When I found her, she was on her knees at the edge of the forest. The fog was swirling around her like a white tornado, but something was wrong. Her skin was smoking where the mist touched it. "It's changing," she gasped as I tried to pull her away. "The fog. It's not just hiding them anymore. It's becoming like them." I watched in horror as the mist seemed to sink into her skin. Wherever it touched, her flesh started to melt like ice cream on a hot day. She screamed in pain as I dragged her toward my truck, but I knew it was too late. The fog had gotten into her lungs, her eyes, everywhere. Sarah died in my arms, on the way to the hospital. Her last words were, "Burn it all, Paul. It's the only way. Fire. They hate the fire." I sat in the hospital parking lot for hours, thinking about everything we'd lost. 37 people gone, 9 children from that school group, and now Sarah. All because of whatever evil thing was hiding in that fog. That's when I made my decision. Sarah was right. I had to burn it all. But what I had to do next, well, it would either save everyone or get me thrown in jail for the rest of my life. I knew what I had to do, but I also knew no one would approve. So I waited until nightfall and drove my truck around the park, filling it with everything I could find that would burn: old wood, gas cans from the maintenance shed, anything that could help start a big fire. The weather report said strong winds were coming from the west. Perfect. The fog always seemed to gather thickest in the eastern part of the park. If I started the fires in the right places, the wind would push the flames right into the heart of where those things lived. Around midnight, I started setting fires in a big circle around the eastern forest. My hands were shaking as I poured the gas and lit the matches. The whole time I could hear those creatures moving in the fog nearby, making their weird wet noises. They knew what I was doing. The fire spread faster than I expected. Soon, half the forest was burning. The flames shot up into the night sky, turning everything orange. I could hear the creatures screaming, not like any animal sound I'd ever heard before. It was like the sound of glass breaking, mixed with a strong wind. As the fire grew, something amazing happened. The fog started to disappear. Not just move away, but actually vanish. The creatures became visible for just a moment. As the flames reached them, they looked like giant jellyfish floating in the air, their clear bodies glowing orange in the firelight. Then they just dissolved, like ice melting in hot water. The fire department came, of course. So did the police and the park service. I admitted to starting the fire right away, told them everything about the fog creatures, the disappearances, and Sarah. They thought I was crazy at first, but then others started backing up my story. The families of the missing people, the surviving teachers from the school group, other rangers who'd seen strange things. In the end, I lost my job, but I didn't go to jail. The official report said it was a forest fire caused by unusual circumstances. Half the park was destroyed, and countless animals died in the flames. I still feel guilty about that. But the fog never came back, and no one else disappeared. Sometimes, on cold mornings when I see normal fog rolling through the mountains, I get scared that those things might return. But deep down, I know they're gone. Whatever they were, they couldn't survive the fire. Sarah was right about that, at least. I still visit her grave sometimes, and the memorial they built for all the people who vanished. I leave flowers and say I'm sorry, even though I know it wasn't really my fault. Some nights, I dream about that fog, about those creatures, about the screaming kids and Sarah melting away. But then I remind myself that at least I stopped it. At least no one else will ever have to go through what we did in the Great Smoky Mountains during that terrible summer of 1983. My name is Thomas Reed, and this happened to me in the winter of 1987. I still remember every detail like it was yesterday, though sometimes I wish I could forget. I was a park ranger at Acadia National Park in Maine, and I loved my job more than anything, well, except for my family. My wife Sarah and our 2 kids, Emma and Jake, lived in a town nearby while I spent my days patrolling the beautiful forests and coastline. That February was unusually cold, even for Maine. The locals called it the hunger moon, an old name for the second full moon of winter when food becomes scarce and wild animals grow desperate. I didn't know then how fitting that name would become. It started with small things at first. Deer carcasses torn apart in ways that didn't look like normal predator kills. Strange howls at night that didn't sound quite like regular wolves, and tourists reporting shadows moving too quickly through the trees. I wrote it all down in my reports, but honestly, who would believe what was really happening? The eclipse was coming in a few days, and the park was busier than usual for February. People wanted to see the moon disappear in the clear winter sky. Sarah called to tell me she was bringing the kids up for the event. They were so excited about camping out and watching the eclipse with their dad. I remember how happy that made me feel, and how I wished I had told them to stay home instead. Looking back now, I should have noticed the signs. The way the animals seemed to vanish from their usual spots, the eerie silence in the forest, the tracks in the snow that didn't match any animal I knew. But sometimes the most obvious warnings are the ones we choose to ignore, especially when we can't imagine how badly things are about to change. It was 2 days before the eclipse when I got the call on my radio. A tour bus hadn't checked in at their hotel, and someone reported seeing it parked along the park's eastern road. Simple enough, I thought. Probably just tourists taking extra time to take pictures. I was so wrong. I found the bus as the sun was setting. It was just sitting there, no tracks in the snow around it, which was strange since it had snowed the night before. As I walked closer, my flashlight beam caught something red in the snow. My stomach dropped. Blood. A lot of it. The bus door was ripped open, not broken, but literally torn off its hinges. Inside. I still have nightmares about what I found inside. 42 passengers, all of them. I can't even describe it. It wasn't like any animal attack I'd ever seen. The seats were torn up, windows shattered, and everything was covered in deep claw marks that were way too big to be from a normal wolf or bear. I radioed for backup, my hands shaking so bad I could barely hold the radio. While waiting, I noticed something that made my blood run cold, tracks in the snow leading away from the bus. They started as animal prints, huge wolf-like paws, but then they turned into human footprints. The state police arrived first, then the FBI. They asked me questions for hours, but I could tell they didn't believe what I was trying to tell them. "Animals don't do this," I kept saying. One agent just patted my shoulder and told me to go home and get some rest. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat at my desk in the ranger station, looking through old files. There had been other incidents over the years, always during lunar eclipses, always in the same part of the park. How had nobody noticed this pattern before? And why did those tracks keep haunting my thoughts? Wolf prints turning into human footprints. My mind didn't want to accept what that might mean. The worst part? Sarah had just texted me that she and the kids were already on their way to the park. They wanted to surprise me early. I thought about telling them to turn back, but what could I say? That I was scared of wolf prints in the snow? That something impossible had happened? I convinced myself I was just shaken up from a terrible crime scene. I told myself wild animals had done it. Maybe wolves driven crazy by hunger. I was about to learn just how wrong I was, and my family would pay the price for my mistake. Sarah and the kids arrived just before sunset the next day. Emma, my 12-year-old, couldn't stop talking about seeing the eclipse. Jake, who was 9, was more interested in the possibility of seeing wolves. If only they knew how those two things would come together. I tried to act normal, but Sarah knew me too well. "Tom, what's wrong?" she asked after the kids went to play in the snow. I wanted to tell her everything, but I just mumbled something about a tough week at work. We set up camp near the ranger station. I insisted on staying close to the building, not out in the regular camping areas. That night, we heard the howls. They were different from regular wolf howls, deeper, almost human-like. Jake got excited, but I noticed Emma hugging her knees to her chest. She always was the sensitive one. The howls seemed to be getting closer. I made sure everyone was inside the ranger station before dark. But Dad, we were going to make s'mores. Jake complained. I told them we'd do it tomorrow, trying to ignore the shadows I kept seeing move between the trees. Around midnight, something started scratching at the door. Not like a bear or a wolf, it was too deliberate. Emma started crying quietly. Sarah held both kids close while I grabbed my rifle. The scratching stopped, and then we heard it. A voice, rough and growling, but definitely a voice. "Let us in, Ranger Reed." My hands were shaking as I aimed my rifle at the door. How did they know my name? The moonlight through the window started to dim as the eclipse began. That's when they attacked. They came through every window at once. They looked like wolves, but wrong, too big. Their faces too human. I fired my rifle, but it barely slowed them down. Sarah screamed as one of them bit her arm. I saw blood on Jake's leg, Emma's shoulder. I was trying to fight them off when I felt teeth sink into my own neck. The last thing I remember before passing out was the eclipse becoming total, and the sounds of my family screaming as they began to change. I woke up as the eclipse was ending. The ranger station was destroyed. Broken glass everywhere, furniture ripped apart, blood on the walls. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was seeing what had happened to my family. They weren't themselves anymore. Sarah, my beautiful Sarah, was pacing on all fours. Her body twisted into something between human and wolf. Her eyes were yellow now, but I could still see her in there, fighting against whatever she'd become. Emma and Jake were huddled in a corner, whimpering. Their faces were already changing, growing longer, fur pushing through their skin. "Dad, it hurts," Emma whispered, her voice breaking into a growl. Jake couldn't even speak anymore. I crawled toward them, feeling the change starting in my own body too. But I was fighting it, holding on to who I was for just a little longer. Sarah lunged at me, not recognizing me anymore. Her teeth, now sharp and long, snapped near my face. I had to do something. They were turning into the same creatures that had killed those people on the bus. Soon they would want to hunt, to kill. I reached for my rifle with shaking hands. Sarah's yellow eyes met mine, and for just a moment, I saw my wife again. She knew what needed to be done. She nodded once, tears running down her now furry face. "I love you," I whispered, and pulled the trigger. The kids were next. I couldn't let them become killers. I couldn't let them live with that. Emma reached for my hand as I raised the rifle one last time. "It's okay, Daddy," she said, just before the wolf took over her voice completely. I don't remember pulling the trigger again. I just remember holding their bodies, human again in death, as the change took me completely. My last human tears mixed with the first growls from my new wolf throat. That was 5 years ago. I never went back to my old life. How could I? The police found the ranger station, my family, the evidence of what happened. I'm sure they made up some story about animal attacks. People believe what they want to believe. I live in the deepest parts of Acadia now. The transformation isn't just during eclipses anymore. It happens every full moon. But I've learned to control it better than those others did. I stay away from people, hunt only animals, and chain myself up when I feel the change coming. Sometimes hikers spot me. They take blurry photos and post stories online about the Acadia wolf man. The park rangers, my old colleagues, know something's out here, but they don't look too hard. Maybe they remember me. Maybe they're afraid of what they'll find. During the day when I'm human, I watch families visiting the park. I see kids like Emma and Jake playing and laughing. I see couples like Sarah and me. That's the hardest part, seeing happy families and remembering what I lost. Every lunar eclipse, I hear them, the other werewolves. They call to me, wanting me to join their pack. But I remember the bus, the tourists, my family. I won't become like them. This is my punishment, my curse, and my responsibility. So if you're ever in Acadia National Park during a full moon, and you hear a lonely howl in the distance, that's me. I'm not a monster, not like the others. I'm just a man who lost everything and chose to stay in the wilderness rather than risk hurting anyone else. But please, if you're planning to visit during an eclipse, don't. Some things in nature aren't meant to be watched. Some shadows are better left alone, and some stories, like mine, should serve as a warning. Because even now, years later, when the hunger moon rises and the eclipse begins, I can still hear their voices calling. And sometimes on the darkest nights, it gets harder and harder to remember why I should resist. My name is Thomas Reed, and this happened to me in the winter of 1987. I still remember every detail like it was yesterday, though sometimes I wish I could forget. I was a park ranger at Acadia National Park in Maine, and I loved my job more than anything, well, except for my family. My wife, Sarah, and our two kids, Emma and Jake, lived in a town nearby while I spent my days patrolling the beautiful forests and coastline. That February was unusually cold, even for Maine. The locals called it the hunger moon, an old name for the second full moon of winter when food becomes scarce and wild animals grow desperate. I didn't know then how fitting that name would become. It started with small things at first. Deer carcasses torn apart in ways that didn't look like normal predator kills. Strange howls at night that didn't sound quite like regular wolves, and tourists reporting shadows moving too quickly through the trees. I wrote it all down in my reports, but honestly, who would believe what was really happening? The eclipse was coming in a few days, and the park was busier than usual for February. People wanted to see the moon disappear in the clear winter sky. Sarah called to tell me she was bringing the kids up for the event. They were so excited about camping out and watching the eclipse with their dad. I remember how happy that made me feel, and how I wished I had told them to stay home instead. Looking back now, I should have noticed the signs. The way the animals seemed to vanish from their usual spots, the eerie silence in the forest, the tracks in the snow that didn't match any animal I knew. But sometimes the most obvious warnings are the ones we choose to ignore, especially when we can't imagine how badly things are about to change. It was 2 days before the eclipse when I got the call on my radio. A tour bus hadn't checked in at their hotel, and someone reported seeing it parked along the park's eastern road. Simple enough, I thought. Probably just tourists taking extra time to take pictures. I was so wrong. I found the bus as the sun was setting. It was just sitting there, no tracks in the snow around it, which was strange since it had snowed the night before. As I walked closer, my flashlight beam caught something red in the snow. My stomach dropped. Blood. A lot of it. The bus door was ripped open, not broken, but literally torn off its hinges. Inside. I still have nightmares about what I found inside. 42 passengers, all of them. I can't even describe it. It wasn't like any animal attack I'd ever seen. The seats were torn up, windows shattered, and everything was covered in deep claw marks that were way too big to be from a normal wolf or bear. I radioed for backup, my hands shaking so bad I could barely hold the radio. While waiting, I noticed something that made my blood run cold, tracks in the snow leading away from the bus. They started as animal prints, huge wolf-like paws, but then they turned into human footprints. The state police arrived first, then the FBI. They asked me questions for hours, but I could tell they didn't believe what I was trying to tell them. "Animals don't do this," I kept saying. One agent just patted my shoulder and told me to go home and get some rest. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat at my desk in the ranger station, looking through old files. There had been other incidents over the years, always during lunar eclipses, always in the same part of the park. How had nobody noticed this pattern before? And why did those tracks keep haunting my thoughts? Wolf prints turning into human footprints. My mind didn't want to accept what that might mean. The worst part? Sarah had just texted me that she and the kids were already on their way to the park. They wanted to surprise me early. I thought about telling them to turn back, but what could I say? That I was scared of wolf prints in the snow? That something impossible had happened? I convinced myself I was just shaken up from a terrible crime scene. I told myself wild animals had done it. Maybe wolves driven crazy by hunger. I was about to learn just how wrong I was, and my family would pay the price for my mistake. Sarah and the kids arrived just before sunset the next day. Emma, my 12-year-old, couldn't stop talking about seeing the eclipse. Jake, who was 9, was more interested in the possibility of seeing wolves. If only they knew how those two things would come together. I tried to act normal, but Sarah knew me too well. "Tom, what's wrong?" she asked after the kids went to play in the snow. I wanted to tell her everything, but I just mumbled something about a tough week at work. We set up camp near the ranger station. I insisted on staying close to the building, not out in the regular camping areas. That night, we heard the howls. They were different from regular wolf howls, deeper, almost human-like. Jake got excited, but I noticed Emma hugging her knees to her chest. She always was the sensitive one. The howls seemed to be getting closer. I made sure everyone was inside the ranger station before dark. But Dad, we were going to make s'mores. Jake complained. I told them we'd do it tomorrow, trying to ignore the shadows I kept seeing move between the trees. Around midnight, something started scratching at the door. Not like a bear or a wolf, it was too deliberate. Emma started crying quietly. Sarah held both kids close while I grabbed my rifle. The scratching stopped, and then we heard it. A voice, rough and growling, but definitely a voice. "Let us in, Ranger Reed." My hands were shaking as I aimed my rifle at the door. How did they know my name? The moonlight through the window started to dim as the eclipse began. That's when they attacked. They came through every window at once. They looked like wolves, but wrong, too big. Their faces too human. I fired my rifle, but it barely slowed them down. Sarah screamed as one of them bit her arm. I saw blood on Jake's leg, Emma's shoulder. I was trying to fight them off when I felt teeth sink into my own neck. The last thing I remember before passing out was the eclipse becoming total, and the sounds of my family screaming as they began to change. I woke up as the eclipse was ending. The ranger station was destroyed. Broken glass everywhere, furniture ripped apart, blood on the walls. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was seeing what had happened to my family. They weren't themselves anymore. Sarah, my beautiful Sarah, was pacing on all fours, her body twisted into something between human and wolf. Her eyes were yellow now, but I could still see her in there, fighting against whatever she'd become. Emma and Jake were huddled in a corner, whimpering. Their faces were already changing, growing longer, fur pushing through their skin. "Dad, it hurts," Emma whispered, her voice breaking into a growl. Jake couldn't even speak anymore. I crawled toward them, feeling the change starting in my own body too. But I was fighting it, holding on to who I was for just a little longer. Sarah lunged at me, not recognizing me anymore. Her teeth, now sharp and long, snapped near my face. I had to do something. They were turning into the same creatures that had killed those people on the bus. Soon they would want to hunt, to kill. I reached for my rifle with shaking hands. Sarah's yellow eyes met mine, and for just a moment, I saw my wife again. She knew what needed to be done. She nodded once, tears running down her now furry face. "I love you," I whispered, and pulled the trigger. The kids were next. I couldn't let them become killers. I couldn't let them live with that. Emma reached for my hand as I raised the rifle one last time. "It's okay, Daddy," she said, just before the wolf took over her voice completely. I don't remember pulling the trigger again. I just remember holding their bodies, human again in death, as the change took me completely. My last human tears mixed with the first growls from my new wolf throat. That was 5 years ago. I never went back to my old life. How could I? The police found the ranger station, my family, the evidence of what happened. I'm sure they made up some story about animal attacks. People believe what they want to believe. I live in the deepest parts of Acadia now. The transformation isn't just during eclipses anymore. It happens every full moon. But I've learned to control it better than those others did. I stay away from people, hunt only animals, and chain myself up when I feel the change coming. Sometimes hikers spot me. They take blurry photos and post stories online about the Acadia Wolfman. The park rangers, my old colleagues, know something's out here, but they don't look too hard. Maybe they remember me. Maybe they're afraid of what they'll find. During the day when I'm human, I watch families visiting the park. I see kids like Emma and Jake playing and laughing. I see couples like Sarah and me. That's the hardest part, seeing happy families and remembering what I lost. Every lunar eclipse, I hear them, the other werewolves. They call to me, wanting me to join their pack. But I remember the bus, the tourists, my family. I won't become like them. This is my punishment, my curse, and my responsibility. So if you're ever in Acadia National Park during a full moon, and you hear a lonely howl in the distance, that's me. I'm not a monster, not like the others. I'm just a man who lost everything and chose to stay in the wilderness rather than risk hurting anyone else. But please, if you're planning to visit during an eclipse, don't. Some things in nature aren't meant to be watched. Some shadows are better left alone. And some stories, like mine, should serve as a warning. I had one chance. I pulled out my lighter with my free hand and set fire to my backpack full of gasoline. Then I threw it as hard as I could at the nearest cactus. The explosion was bigger than I expected. It must have ignited something in the cacti themselves. The fire spread through their root network like lightning. They started making sounds, not quite screams, but something close. Their flesh bubbled and burst, but they didn't let go of me. I don't remember much after that. The doctor said I was in shock. They found me 2 days later, half a mile from the burn zone. My arms and legs were gone, eaten away by the cacti's acid, or maybe torn off when I was trying to escape. I honestly don't know which. The official story is that there was a chemical spill in the park that made people hallucinate. They say the bodies were from a bus crash that happened the same week. They cleaned up all the burned cacti before any real scientists could study them. But I know what I saw. I know what happened to Sarah, to those rescue teams, to all those innocent people. And I know something else too. Not all the cacti burned that night. I see on the news sometimes stories about missing hikers in other desert parks, stories about strange movements in the night, stories about plants that shouldn't be able to move. So I'm telling you this as a warning. If you're ever out in the desert and you see a cactus that doesn't look quite right, or if you hear something that sounds like wet ropes moving through sand, run. Run as fast as you can, because they're still out there. They're learning, they're growing, and they're hungry. My name is Maria Thompson, and this happened to me back in 1995 when I was working as a park ranger at Badlands National Park in South Dakota. I still have trouble talking about it. Actually, these written words are the first time I've shared my story with anyone. But people need to know the truth about what's hiding in those dust storms. I loved my job back then. Every morning I'd wake up excited to put on my ranger uniform and head out into those strange, beautiful rock formations. The Badlands got their name for a reason. The landscape looks like something from another planet, with tall, striped cliffs and deep canyons carved by wind and rain over millions of years. My twin brother Jake worked there too, at a different ranger station. We used to joke that we were the only twins in the Park Service who could tell when the other one was in trouble. I wish I'd paid more attention to that connection when the storm started. It began with little things at first. Hikers would report hearing strange sounds during dust storms, not the usual howling wind, but something that sounded almost like whispers. Then people started going missing, one or two at first, usually during the worst storms when the dust was so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. We searched for them, of course, but never found anything. Not a backpack, not a piece of clothing, not even footprints leading away. It was like they'd been plucked right off the face of the earth. I remember the first time I felt something was really wrong. I was driving back to my station one evening when a dust storm rolled in faster than any I'd ever seen. The radio crackled with static, and through my windshield, I could have sworn I saw shapes moving in the dust, things that were too big to be tumbleweeds, too fluid to be people. That's when I got the first call about Pine Ridge, a small town just outside the park's boundaries. All 63 people who lived there had vanished during a dust storm. Just gone. Every single one of them. I pulled over and sat there, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, as I listened to the wind screaming outside. But it wasn't just wind anymore. There was something else in that sound, something hungry. Looking back, I guess I should have known something was wrong when all the wild animals started disappearing too. No more coyotes howling at night. No more prairie dogs popping up from their burrows. Even the birds stopped flying over certain parts of the park. Animals know things that we don't. They can sense danger before we can. The day I finally saw them changed everything. I was checking on an emergency shelter near one of our hiking trails when another dust storm came rolling in. Usually I'd hurry inside right away, but something made me pause. The dust wasn't moving right. Normal storms blow in one direction, following the wind. But this dust, it was swirling in circles, like water going down a drain. That's when I saw it through my binoculars. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. In the middle of the storm, the dust was taking shape, forming into something that looked almost human, but not quite. It had arms that were too long, fingers that stretched out like smoke, and its face. Well, I guess you could call it a face, but it was always changing. Like when you stare at clouds and see different shapes. I couldn't move. My whole body felt cold, even though it was a hot summer day. Then I saw more of them forming, 5, maybe 6 shapes made of dust and darkness. They were moving toward another emergency shelter, where 2 hikers had taken refuge. I tried to radio a warning, but all I got was static. All I could do was watch through my binoculars as these things surrounded the shelter. The dust creatures seemed to press against the walls, seeping through every tiny crack and gap. I heard screaming, the kind of screaming that stays with you forever. Then silence. When the storm cleared 10 minutes later, I ran to the shelter. The door was still locked from the inside, but the hikers were gone. The only traces left were their backpacks and 2 half-empty water bottles on the table. That night I called an emergency meeting at the main ranger station. I told them everything I'd seen. Some people thought I was crazy, but Jake believed me. He always did. If only I'd known then that believing me would get him killed. After that first attack, things got worse fast. Way worse. The dust creatures grew bolder, like they knew we'd figured out what they were but couldn't do anything to stop them. They started targeting our ranger stations, one after another. Maple Point Station was first. The storm came at night. I was on the radio with Sarah, the ranger on duty there, when it happened. She was in the middle of giving me a weather report when her voice changed. "Maria," she whispered, "there's something wrong with the dust outside. It's pressing against the windows." Then I heard the glass crack. Her last words were, "They're coming in through the ceiling." After that, just static. The next morning, Maple Point Station was empty. 4 rangers gone. But this time, the creatures had left something behind. Long, twisting marks in the dust on the floor. Like giant fingerprints. We took photos, but they just looked blurry and wrong. Like your eyes couldn't quite focus on them. I started studying the storms obsessively. I noticed patterns, how the dust moved differently when the creatures were inside it, how the air felt heavy and electric just before they appeared. I marked every attack on a map, trying to predict where they'd strike next. Jake helped me. He was stationed at Pine Ridge Station, about 20 miles from mine, and we'd radio each other every hour, checking in. I remember our last normal conversation. Jake was telling me about some weird scratching sounds he'd been hearing in the walls of his station. I told him to get out of there, to come stay with me until we figured out what to do. "Don't worry, sis," he said, laughing that easy laugh of his. "I've got the place locked up tight. Nothing's getting in here." But something did get in. and I had to listen to it happen. Want me to tell you about that night? About what those things did to my brother? It's the hardest part to talk about, but maybe it's the most important. I was in my station when Jake made his last radio call. It was just past midnight, and the dust storm came out of nowhere. Not from the east like usual, but from all directions at once. Like his station was the center of a giant whirlpool of dust. "Maria," his voice was shaking. "They're here. The dust. It's different this time. Thicker. I can see faces in it." I grabbed my keys, ready to drive out there, but Jake stopped me. "Don't come, please. You can't help. They're already inside." I heard the windows breaking. Jake's breathing got faster. "I'm in the storage closet," he whispered. "But they're seeping through the door. Maria, I can see them clearly now. They're beautiful in a horrible way, like dark clouds with eyes made of lightning." Then I heard the closet door splinter. Jake screamed, not in fear, but in pain. "They're not just taking people," he gasped. "They're eating us, pulling us apart like cotton candy." His voice got weaker. "Maria, listen to me. I can see how they work now. They can only come in the big storms. They need the dust to hold their shape. Without it, they're nothing." Those were his last words. The radio went silent, but I could still feel him there, somehow. That twin connection we used to joke about? It snapped like a rubber band stretched too far, and just like that I knew my brother was gone. I drove to his station anyway, as soon as the storm cleared. The closet door was shredded like wet paper. There was dust everywhere, swirled into strange patterns on the floor. And blood, not much, just a few drops. That's all they left of my brother. That night changed me. I stopped talking after that. What was there to say? Nobody would believe the whole truth, and I couldn't bear to tell lies. But I didn't stop fighting. Instead, I started hunting them. Should I tell you about how I learned to survive? How I figured out their patterns and turned their own storms against them? After Jake died, I became a different person. I turned my ranger station into a research center, covering the walls with weather maps and storm patterns. I stopped trying to warn people. No one would believe me anyway. Instead, I watched. I learned. I survived. Here's what I figured out. These creatures, whatever they are, can only exist inside dust storms that are at least half a mile wide. They need the dust like we need air. When the storm dies down, they have to retreat back to wherever they come from. I started tracking the storms on radar, marking where they formed and how they moved. After a while, I could predict where they'd appear almost every time. I also learned their hunting patterns. They're drawn to electricity, lights, radios, phones. That's why they hit the ranger stations first. Now, when I see a storm coming, I shut everything off. I sit in the dark, perfectly quiet, and I wait. Sometimes I can hear them outside, their bodies brushing against the walls like sandpaper, but they can't find me anymore. I still work at the park. People think I'm strange, the silent ranger who's obsessed with dust storms. My supervisors keep me around because I've never been wrong about predicting dangerous weather. They don't know I'm not predicting weather at all. I'm tracking monsters. Sometimes, on really dusty days, visitors ask me why all the windows in my station are sealed with special tape, or why I have so many weather radar screens. I just hand them a paper that says, "If you see a dust storm coming, don't try to outrun it. Turn off everything electrical. Stay still. Stay quiet. Stay alive." Most of them laugh it off, but some people, the ones who've been out in the park during the big storms, the ones who've heard things they can't explain, they don't laugh. They take the paper, fold it carefully, and put it in their pocket. I haven't spoken a word in 29 years now, but I'm writing this down because the storms are getting bigger, and the creatures are getting bolder. Last week they took an entire tour bus. 47 people gone in 5 minutes. So consider this my warning to you. If you're ever driving through the Badlands and you see a dust storm coming, don't convince yourself it's just wind and sand. Turn off your engine. Stay quiet. And pray they don't notice you. Because they're still out there, hunting in the dust. And they're always hungry. My name is Kevin Wright, and this happened to me back in 1998 when I was working as a park ranger at Olympic National Park in Washington State. I've kept this story to myself for years, but I need to write it down now, while I still can. While I still feel human enough to hold a pen. I loved my job at first. Being out in those old forests was like stepping into another world. The trees there are ancient. Some of them have been growing for over 1,000 years. I had my own little ranger station deep in the park, shared with about 12 other rangers. We'd take turns patrolling different areas, helping lost hikers and making sure everyone was safe. Everything changed that rainy October morning when I got a call about some teenagers who'd gone missing near the Grove of Elders, one of the oldest parts of the forest. Nothing seemed weird about it at first. People got lost in the park all the time. Usually we'd find them within a day or two, cold and scared but alive. But when I went to look for those kids, I saw something that still haunts me. One of the massive old growth trees was bleeding, not sap, actual dark red blood, oozing out of its trunk like someone had cut into a person. I thought maybe someone had hurt themselves and touched the tree. But the blood was coming from inside the tree itself. It was pulsing out, like a heartbeat. I called it in, but nobody believed me. They said I was just seeing things in the rain and the dark, but I knew what I saw. Over the next few weeks, more people started disappearing, not just in ones or twos like usual, but in groups. Whole families would go hiking and never come back. Before I knew it, 89 people had vanished without a trace. I started finding more bleeding trees too. Always the oldest ones, with trunks wider than a car. Sometimes at night, I thought I could hear them whispering, not like leaves in the wind, actual whispers, like people talking in their sleep. But every time I got close to record the sound, it would stop. I knew something was terribly wrong in my forest. I just didn't know how wrong until it was too late. That's when things got really strange at our ranger station. None of the search parties could find any clues about the missing people. No backpacks, no footprints, nothing. It was like they'd just vanished into thin air. But I kept finding more of those bleeding trees, always in the areas where people went missing. One night, while checking the Grove of Elders, I noticed something I'd somehow missed before. There were marks carved into the trees, not fresh ones made by visitors, but old, deep symbols that looked like they'd been there for hundreds of years. They reminded me of writing, but not like anything I'd ever seen before. When I touched them, they felt warm, even in the cold night air. I started spending all my free time in that grove, taking pictures and making notes. The other rangers thought I was losing it. Maybe I was, but I knew these trees were hiding something. Sometimes when I pressed my ear against their trunks, I could hear what sounded like people moving around inside, like there were hollow spaces in there, spaces where something lived. Then came the night. Everything changed. I was doing my usual evening patrol when I heard screaming coming from our ranger station. I ran back as fast as I could, but by the time I got there, I can barely write about what I saw. The trees around the station had opened up like giant mouths, and things were coming out of them, tall, dark shapes that looked almost human, but wrong somehow. Their skin was like bark, and their eyes glowed like fireflies. They were taking my friends, my fellow rangers, not killing them, worse. They were somehow pulling them into the trees, like the trunks were made of water they could just step through. I heard Tom, one of our senior rangers, screaming for help as they dragged him in. I wanted to help, but I couldn't move. I just stood there, hidden in the shadows, watching as one by one, all 12 of my colleagues disappeared into those trees. The worst part? The whole time this was happening, I could feel something in my head, like a voice trying to tell me this was all okay. That this was natural, that this was how it had always been, and how it should be. I ran back to my cabin and locked myself in. But I knew locks wouldn't keep them out. Nothing would. Because they weren't invading our forest, they were the forest. They'd always been here, waiting. I spent the next few days hiding in my cabin, only going out when I had to. But I couldn't stop thinking about what was inside those trees. I needed to know the truth, even if it meant risking my life. So one morning, I packed my flashlight and camera and went back to the grove of elders. This time I found something I wish I hadn't. One of the biggest trees had a crack in it, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. The bleeding had stopped, but the bark around the opening felt warm, like skin. I should have turned back right then, but I didn't. I turned on my flashlight and went inside. The tree was hollow, but not in a natural way. There were rooms inside, spaces that shouldn't have been possible. The walls looked like wood but felt soft and alive, and there were these glowing veins running through everything, pumping with what I now knew was human blood. That's when I saw them clearly for the first time, the ancient ones. They were tall, like trees walking around on root-like legs. Their faces were smooth like polished wood, with eyes that glowed green. They moved silently, working on something I couldn't understand at first. Then I realized what they were doing. They were connecting all the missing people to the tree's veins, like they were feeding the forest. But the worst part wasn't seeing my fellow rangers hanging there, connected to those awful veins. It was realizing they were still alive, and they looked peaceful, happy even, like they wanted to be there. I heard them then, not with my ears but in my head. They were singing, all of them together. The ancient ones, the trees, and all the people they'd taken, they were one big, living thing. And they were inviting others to join them. I wanted to run, to scream, to call for help. But who would believe me? Who would I even call? The voice in my head kept getting louder, telling me this was right. That humans were meant to feed the forest, to become part of something bigger than themselves. I managed to get out of that tree, but I knew I couldn't escape. Not really. Because now I could hear the singing all the time, calling me back. And part of me, a bigger part than I want to admit, wanted to answer that call. A week later, I saw something that broke me completely. I was following these strange lights in the forest at night. I know I shouldn't have, but by then I wasn't thinking straight anymore. The singing in my head led me to a clearing I'd never seen before. even though I thought I knew every inch of this park. There were about 20 hikers there, people who'd gone missing recently. But they weren't trying to escape. They were just standing there, swaying like trees in the wind. The ancient ones came out of their trees, moving in a circle around the hikers. Then they started. I don't know how else to say this. They started turning the hikers into trees. It wasn't quick or painless like in fairy tales. The ancient ones pressed their hands against each person's chest, and roots started growing from their feet into the ground. Their skin turned to bark, slowly creeping up their bodies. Some people screamed, but most just smiled, like they were having a beautiful dream. I watched as their arms stretched up into branches, their fingers splitting into twigs and leaves. Their faces smoothed out until they were just patterns in the bark. Within an hour, where there had been 20 people, there were 20 new saplings, their leaves whispering in the night air. But here's the thing that really got to me. I could still hear them thinking. Not as separate people anymore, but as part of that one big mind that lived in the forest. They were happy. They weren't scared or sad. They felt like they'd finally found where they belonged. I ran back to my cabin and wrote everything down in my journal. I knew I had to tell someone what was happening here, but the voice in my head kept getting louder. It told me that this was natural, that humans were just young trees that had forgotten their true purpose, that we were meant to return to the forest. Every night after that, I dreamed of roots growing from my feet, of my blood feeding the ancient trees, and every morning it got harder to remember why I should resist. I'm writing this last part with hands that are already starting to feel like bark. I know now why I have to join them, not because they're forcing me, but because I finally understand the truth. These ancient ones, they aren't evil. They were here long before humans walked the earth. The forest isn't just trees. It's one giant living thing, older and wiser than we can imagine, and it's dying because of us. The blood it takes, the people it changes, it's not just food, it's healing. Every person who joins makes the forest stronger. Last night, I went back to the grove of elders. I could see my fellow rangers now, their tree shapes glowing with that same green light in their eyes. They looked peaceful, complete. The ancient ones stood around me, waiting. Not threatening, just. The singing in my head isn't scary anymore. It's beautiful. It's the song of the earth itself, of roots talking to each other deep underground, of leaves drinking sunlight. We've just forgotten how to hear it. If you're reading this, it means you've found my journal in my empty cabin. By now, I'll be part of the forest too. Don't look for me. Don't send search parties. But if you're walking through Olympic National Park and you feel a strange urge to walk deeper into the old-growth forest, if you hear a kind of singing that seems to come from inside your own head, know that we're here. We're happy. We're healing the forest, becoming something greater than just ourselves. And there's always room for one more tree in our grove. This is Ranger Kevin Wright's last report. What happens next is up to you. The journal ends here, found 3 weeks later on the desk of an empty ranger cabin. The writer was never seen again. Each year, Olympic National Park's old-growth forest grows a little wider, a little deeper, and hikers report hearing strange songs on the wind.